I feel I should say something memorable, but I can't think of a thing.
First say today's date.
What is today's date?
It's August 14th.
August the 14th, 1997.
And where are we?
And we're at, well, what is the name of the town? Pittsfield?
No, we're in Middlefield.
Middlefield, Massachusetts, at Irene's Delightful Country House, having a family reunion.
And we decided to take some time out to tell stories of your life in Poland and in America, and stories of your family.
Okay. And my children arranged to take the time to get me to tell stories about my life and my family. And it's something that I'm delighted to share with my children now, and hopefully with my grandchildren and great-grandchildren at a later time.
Okay. All right, so we thought that you could talk about, start out with
You
your,
can sit down over there. You don't have to get me a good
with
time.
your early experiences in Piotrków.
Well, I was born in Poland.
What
Name
was
of
the
this-
year? When were you born?
I was born in 1917 in Piotrków Trybunalski in Poland. My father had left for America. My mother, our family had to wait 5 years. Actually turned out to be 6 years before we could join my father. My parents' original plan was that my father would go to America, work long enough to earn the money to buy the tickets to bring his family, and then we would join him. But unfortunately, there was a wave of anti-immigration feeling at the time, and Congress passed a law saying that a man had to be a citizen before he could bring his family. That required 5 years residence. So immediately, their plans were frustrated, and my father had to arrange to send us money, and that wasn't always so simple because he became ill, and that left my mother without any source of income. However, she was a very resourceful woman. Before her marriage and even after her marriage, when she worked together with my father, she was a seamstress, and so she went back to work as a seamstress. She had her own little workshop in the apartment, and what she would do, she would go out and solicit trade, and she employed a young woman by the name of Panna Hela, which means Miss Helen. And Miss Helen would sit at the sewing machine all day and carry out my mother's plans. And some of these things that my mother sewed were really beautiful. She would sew trousseaux for brides, and the brides would order like several dozens of pillowcases, but each pillowcase had an individual design with lace inserts and embroidery that was done by machine. And my mother would make up the designs, and then she would have them carried out by either the embroidery person or Panna Hela. Then she would have some very interesting clients. Once there was an old gentleman, very old-fashioned man, and he typically Polish nobility type. He had the big gray mustaches and gray hair, looked very distinguished, and he wore these old-fashioned white stiff collars, and those are the ones that he ordered from my mother. Shirts with those stiff white collars that were removable. And no one wore that style, but it probably went back to the style of his youth. And then one time, she had a client who lived in our apartment. He was a merchant, and he would import all kinds of dry goods from Germany. And in order to advertise his business, he had this idea of making up little tiny handkerchiefs out of very fine silky material and have the name of his business stamped on the handkerchiefs. It was sort of a precursor to what we know nowadays, you know, there's all kinds of fancy advertising. And my mother sewed, well, what she had to do was make hems on those little tiny handkerchiefs. And there were hundreds of them. And then they gave them out at the movie house.
That was a great idea.
Yeah, that was a very nice idea. Now, this man, his name was Corman, and in his apartment he had a little store. It was a long room, and there were boxes and boxes of the most enchanting and delightful materials. They were hat trimmings and trimmings for dresses. And my friend, his daughter, Franya, this translation would be Frances. She and I were very good friends, and we played together all the time. So when usually her parents were not in the store, the customers would either drop in or come in by appointment. So this little store was just there for us to play in all the time.
Like
And
a
we would
playhouse.
We would play there for hours, you know, putting on the different, they had velvet leaves and flowers and cherries, the kind that you put on little old ladies' hats, and beautiful embroidered ribbons and trimmings. We just loved that place. And in Franya's house, there was also a balcony. The nearest thing I could compare it to were the fire escapes in New York, only there were no ladders to connect them. It was just a balcony, a little narrow balcony. And it looked out upon our street was Shevska. The name of the street was Shevska, and the number was Numer 8, which means 8. And right across, this was a little narrow street, right across the street was a garden that had horse chestnut trees. And I remember playing on that balcony, and the horse chestnut trees, the leaves would practically touch the balcony. And we could reach out our hand and touch the chestnuts. But the most wonderful part was when the trees were in bloom and they had the most beautiful white blooms. And we loved to play on that balcony. Now one day Franya must have had a very bad something, you know, she just felt mean and miserable because my mother had all kinds of staffs. My mother always had all kinds of little health problems. And this time she called it, in America she called it the itching. She had a rash and it itched terribly. So she got this staff and it came in a little white jar, which to me was a beautiful object. We had very few toys, very few. And most of the toys were, we just turned objects into toys. And that was so, I ran to Franya's house to show her this wonderful jar that my mother had given me. And something went, oh, I know what happened. Franya had a porcelain egg, and I was playing with the egg, and the balcony didn't have a solid floor. It had slats of metal, and I dropped the egg through the slats of metal, and it fell down on the ground and shattered into little pieces. And Franya was really angry, so she took that what I thought was a beautiful jar, and she threw it down, and it fell, you know, broke into little pieces. Around the corner from that street, I remember spending some Yom Kippur days. Some friend of my sister's lived there, and Yom Kippur was of course, the most solemn day of the year for us. It was extremely solemn, and my mother would light a candle, like a Yortzeit candle that burned all night. So when you woke up in the morning, the candle was still burning. And I remember we went to that girl's house. Of course, all the women, all the men were in shul, they were praying, but we kids were free to come and go. So we went to this girl's house, and there was this candle, you know, throwing this solemn light over the food that was spread on the table. There were wonderful cakes and pastries and all kinds of wonderful things. And you know, we must have had a lot of self-control because we didn't eat them. We didn't even try to taste them. We were we were so imbued with the spirit of the holiday that we felt this would be something wrong to do.
Even though your family wasn't religious, per
Well,
se.
my mother was not religious, but she was traditional. She liked to observe the rituals, and she never questioned them. She just thought that's the way it should be done. One beautiful thing that I remember, when we woke up in the morning, my mother taught us to say a prayer, and I really didn't learn till many years later the meaning of the prayer. And I do remember the first few words in the Hebrew. It goes, Modi ani lefanecha, and it means, thank you, Lord, for returning my soul to me. I wish I'd known what I was saying at the time, because it's such a beautiful thing to say. You know, when we go to sleep, we take it for granted that we'll wake up, but there's no guarantee. And just think how beautiful it is to open the day with saying, thank you, Lord, for returning my soul to me.
You lived in an area where there are other Jewish people. What were your dealings and your memories of the people in Poland who were not Jewish, the majority of the people?
Well, you're right. Most of the people with whom we had interactions, of course, were Jewish people.
Well, there's one thing I was just going to ask
Yes.
you, just not to interrupt this, but the man you were talking about with the handkerchiefs, was he
Yes.
Jewish?
Yes.
So were most of your mother's clients Jewish?
No, my mother's clients were Polish or Jewish. It didn't matter. It was just, she would be recommended, you know. She had
Okay.
a real nice clientele.
So there wasn't such segregation among the population that she wouldn't do business with.
Oh, no. The
With
segregation was not like segregation in America where you had a certain section roped off for blacks. There was at one time definite segregation. One of the main streets in the city was called Jerozolimska, which means Jerusalem Street. And the Jews called it Judengasse, the street of the Jews. And that's where a great many Jews lived. And it was a remnant of the time when they had the ghetto walled off.
Oh.
But it was no longer walled off at the time. Jews simply remained there because that's where they had lived for probably hundreds of years.
But there was a lot more interaction among the
There was
population.
a total interaction amongst
Okay.
Poles and Jews because
Okay.
there was no segregation. In our building, well, the particular side of the building that I lived on was mostly Jewish. But the building that faced the front of the street, there were many Poles living there. And we, sometimes people made friends with them and visited. And I remember I had a Polish friend who had two older sisters. And these sisters had these very beautiful dolls, porcelain dolls, real old-fashioned dolls with beautiful old-fashioned clothes. And sometimes the sisters would allow us to play with those dolls. But this was a Polish girl. I don't even remember her name. And of course with merchants and doing business and going to the marketplace.
I
Now-
remember once you told about how some of the peasants would come in on their wagons.
Oh
Can you
yes, I
describe
was just
them?
going to tell
Yeah,
you
so
that.
getting back to Rosie's original question of the interaction with the non-Jewish.
Well, I'll get to
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Because this was a normal interaction going to the marketplace. The merchants who came in with fresh dairy food and vegetables and such were all peasants who came in from the countryside, and they simply spread their merchandise on the ground. They would have a cloth and just spread the merchandise on the ground. And of course my mother would go shopping and she would bargain and you know, pick up like a pound of butter. Usually the butter was on a green leaf, a large green leaf, and shaped beautifully like a leaf. And there were other things that, you know,
What did some of the people look like and what did they wear? The
well,
peasants.
the peasants wore peasant clothes. They wore mostly cotton skirts and blouses, and there was no such thing as going to the beauty shop. The only women, the closest thing to approaching a beauty shop, of course, were the Jewish women who wore wigs. And the wigs, especially their holiday wigs, were very elaborate, very beautiful. In fact, I had an aunt who was a wig maker, and I will certainly tell you the story of my aunt because it was such a good story. You want to know about interactions between Gentiles and Poles, that's a good place to begin. My aunt, Hanaliba, her name was Hanaliba, and she was a very beautiful woman as I remember her. She was tall, stately, and she was quite well endowed, so that when she stood up, she could pass for a Wagnerian heroine. And I once went to her workshop where she made her wigs. It was an interesting place because she had human hair, and she would comb out that hair very carefully and very slowly, over and over again, till the hair was totally without knots and shining and beautiful. And I don't know how she shaped it into wigs, but one of the ways that she carried on her business, she would deliver these wigs to her clients in nearby towns and villages. And so she had to do a lot of traveling on trains. And after the First World War, when the Poles gained their independence, some of the Polish people, the hooligan types, decided that they'd make a pogrom on the Jews. Well, they went on the train. My aunt was on the train, and there were about 6 or 10 tough guys, and they went through the train, and whenever they saw a Jewish man, and the Jewish men wore the long coats and the beards and, of course, the side curls, the payas, they would grab the man's long coat, it was called a capote, and they would cut it in half, cut it short. And that was a great humiliation, because to wear the non-traditional clothes was humiliation. And then they would cut the beard, and of course, for a religious Jew, that was a terrible humiliation. It was like you could destroy the man that way, and they cut off his payas, his side curls. Well, when they came into my aunt's compartment, there were people sitting there, and she stood up to her full height, and she was imposing when she stood up to her full height. And she said, "Just you wait a minute. Do you realize that your Lord Jesus had a beard?"
Ha, 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 ha.
And the guys just started to scratch their heads, and they said, yeah, he's got a beard. So, well, what are you doing here? And they left. They just left the train. Now, that's the kind of woman she was. It's a wonderful story.
But
That's
it's
a
not
story.
really true. He just had a foo.
What?
He had a foo. He had a Fu Manchu mustache. Jesus.
Oh, I rather doubt it. But there's no Jewish child who could doubt what Jesus looked like, because it was not a very large city, but I remember at least 2 major churches. One of the major churches was at least 400 years old, but the one I remember the most was the one that was in the square right at the end of Shevska, the little street I lived in, opened up into 3 adjoining squares. But the one that had opened, the immediate opening, was to the main square, which at the far end had the main church. And as I remember it, to me it seemed like a very large building. My brother said when he went there it was really a small building, but it was very elegant as I remember. It was gray, and it had a very high staircase. And on holidays, begging was a profession in Poland amongst Polish people and Jewish people. There were some people who just had no other way of making a living except begging. And on Sundays and Christian holidays, those stairs would be filled with beggars, just sitting at the edge and holding their hands out. And as people walked in, they would throw a coin in their hands. But of course, everywhere on the churches there were statues of Jesus, and crucified Jesus. And when you went into the home of a Polish person, in every room there was a crucifix with the crucified Christ on it. So no Jewish child was ignorant of what Jesus looked like.
How was Jesus depicted
In
that town?
In that time, well, they were the traditional type of crucified figures. However, amongst the Jewish children, we had our own version, and we even had names. And one of the names, it was a derisive name, was called Yosela Pendrick. Pendrick, I don't know what it means, but it was a derisive name. And Yosela, of course, means little Joseph, because we considered that his name was Little Joseph or something like that, you know. And the relations between the Polish children and Jews were usually not too good, although I did have some Polish friends. But I remember once on Sukkot, there were 3 sukkahs in our yard. The way the apartment houses were built in that town, there were 4 buildings around a courtyard. And in our courtyard, there were 3 sukkahs. One of them was right underneath our apartment. We had really a ground floor apartment, was elevated above the ground, so that the top of the sukkah, the ceiling or the roof, was right below our apartment. And my mother would pass the food down through the roof, because you know the roof of the sukkah is open. And well, the first thing she did on Sukkot, for the first meal, we would eat in our own apartment, but she brought the food down to be blessed in the sukkah, and then she took it back up to the apartment. But a few meals during those 8 days, we ate in the sukkah. And the most beautiful part, you know, the sukkah usually came around October, so the days were short, and it started getting dark early. And in the sukkah, they had to have artificial light. At that time, we had gas in the house, but no electricity. And they usually had candles. They ate by candlelight in the sukkah. But before it was time for the meal, it would get dark before it was time for the meal. And we kids used to sit in that sukkah and tell ghost stories. And I still remember the shivery feeling of listening to those stories by candlelight or totally in the dark. It was part of the joy of Sukkot. But the real joy of Sukkot was decorating the sukkah. And what we would do was go through the town and pick horse chestnuts. They were very abundant in the fall. The trees would just shed their chestnuts, and we would go with bags or whatever. But I remember once my brother and I were out gathering chestnuts, and I was carrying mine this way in my arms. My brother was carrying them the same way. Now, we passed the church, and he realized that I was walking by the church with his head uncovered. And that was a no-no, because that was a sign of respect for the church, and this we could not do. So he dropped all his chestnuts and grabbed his hat and put it on his head. That is to give you an inkling of the kind of attitudes that we had towards their religion. There was no respect on our part for their religion, and no respect on their part for our religion. My mother had a Polish friend, Pani Puzanowska. She was the milk lady. She delivered our milk. Now, Pani Puzanowska was better off than a lot of the Polish people in that town. Her husband worked on the railroad, and they had a little house of their own at the edge of town. It was something very unusual. There were a few people who had their own little houses. One of my uncles did. But she had this darling little house. It was a brick house, and she had 2 daughters whom I remember as being very beautiful. They were young girls. I'd say they were in high school. They had long braids, and every time we came to that house, they were always doing their homework. They were always studying. And Pani Puzanowska would invite my mother and her 3 kids, my brother, my sister, and myself, to spend the day there. And my mother would bring food, because of course she couldn't eat Pani Puzanowska's food. And it was a wonderful outing for us. They did have a cow in a barn. And if you know my brother, you know, he was a little devil. If he had, he had a place to go, he went someplace, he had to explore every nook and cranny. So he climbed to the top of the barn. It was covered with moss, but it had a hole. And you know what? He fell down, fell down right into the muck. And my mother had to clean him up.
What, your brother's name?
My brother, well, we called him Mendel. So in America, it became Manny, because the school principal, where we first went to school at PS 84, he gave us our English names. My father took a day off from work, took us in to get it registered at school, and the school principal said, "No, you can't have these foreign names."
What were your foreign names?
Well, my name was Tesha. My sister's name was Lodja. My name is Tesha. My Jewish name was Tipola,
Right?
for short for Tzipora. And my sister's name was Leah, so she was called Lodja. And my brother's name
is Polish.
yes. And my brother's name was Mendel. And I don't remember that he had a Polish name. He
What
didn't
does
go to
Tesha
school
mean?
yet. Tesha? I don't know what it means.
But that's
Is it a Russian or Polish name?
It's a Polish name. So, so the principal said, now let's see, your name is Tesha, you're going to be Sybil. I said, oh no, I'm not going to have that for a name. Why not? Well, Sybil, it means onion. I don't want to be called by the name of an onion. So then my name became Celia. He said, okay, so your name will be Celia. Okay, that was fine.
That's how you
But
got
men
it.
who-
Means onion in what? In Polish?
Huh?
What is, Sybil means onion in what language?
Sybil in Yiddish.
Oh,
A Sybil,
I see.
Sybil
Yeah.
is onion. Now, he wanted to give my brother a name. Matt. Oh, Matt. Yeah, he wanted to give him the name Matt. And my brother said, oh no. Why not? Because there was a butcher shop, a Polish one, a non-kosher butcher shop, at the other end of Shevska Street, and they had a big dog, a huge dog called Max. And this Max was always running around the street with his tongue hanging out, and barking, you know. I don't know if he ever hurt anybody, but my brother said, oh no, Max will not be my name. So he became, the principal said, now I have a real good name for you. I will call you Emmanuel. That means to be with God. And then you could be called Manny for short. So many liked that. And of course, Leah became Lily. So that's how we all got our English names.
I just wanted to, we'll shoot back across the ocean to Poland, and could you tell us the story of Beryl of Escher, please?
Oh yes, I would love to tell the story of Beryl of Escher.
How old were you?
Well,
We're going back in time?
going back in time, and it's kind of vague in my mind what my age was, because my father was already in America. Now, I was 11 when I came here, so I was at least 6 years old. And I was probably between 5 and 6 because I didn't go to school yet. But my sister did go to school. Lodja went to school every day, and when she came home, she would bring her books, and she would tell me what she had to do. When you came to school, you had to curtsy to the teacher and say good morning. So she would curtsy and say, Dzień dobry, pani Manecka. Pani means Mrs. Manecka was the teacher's name, and then I would imitate her. And we had a piece of furniture that was like a dressing table with a large three-way mirror. And I would stand in front of the three-way mirror and curtsy and hold my sister's books and say, Dzień dobry, pani Manecka. And my mother loved to watch me do it. So I was just imitating my sister. But anyway, the form of discipline, my mother was not a great disciplinarian. She was pretty easygoing. But there were times when we kids were just kids. We were disobedient. And there was a whip hanging on the wall. It was called a conchik. It had one little string, and it never hurt anybody. It was just, it was psychological. The fact that you got hit with the conjugal was a punishment, and it was humiliating. So all my mother had to do was reach for the conjugal, and we jumped. But there were times when we were just so bad that the conjugal wouldn't work. And then my mother had the ultimate threat, and so did most of the women in Piotrków, barrel of Escher. Now, we didn't know what barrel of Escher was. What was he? An animal? A monster? A boy? A girl? We didn't know. And no one had ever seen barrel of Escher because no one ever dared behave that badly. But one day, my mother had a support group. That's what you'd call it nowadays. There were women whose husbands were in America, and they were waiting for their husbands to become citizeners. And
A good topic for Oprah Winfrey.
yeah.
Husbands who left for America.
And so she invited one of these ladies to have tea with her. It was winter time, so most of the living was done in the kitchen except on Shabbat and holidays when we went to the main room where we had a big white ceramic stove that was built into the room. But in the winter time, we mostly lived in the kitchen except to go to sleep. And so, the big black stove was heated. It had the coal and the fire in it. And my mother had several chairs. And who was that? Pani Litmanovich. Pani Litmanovich was one of my mother's friends. And she was sitting there having tea. And she started to boast about her son. Vladek Litmanovich. Vladek was the terror of the school. It was. Now I recall. Yeah, I must have been in the kindergarten or lower grade because I knew Vladek because he was a terror. He was absolutely a terror. Before class started, he would play games. He would say, "I'm Ivan the Terrible. Ivan Strashny. Yeah, Ivan Strashny." And then he would go and hit all the girls, and we would run or pull their braids. Well, he was a terror. And there is his mother sitting there boasting about it, what a wonderful kid she had. Now, I was the only child in the house. My sister must have gone to visit someplace. And Mendel was probably asleep because it was already dark. So I just went up to Pani Litmanovich and I said, You're a liar. Your Vladek is a brat.
And you were about 5 years old.
Between 5 and 6. And her jaw dropped. And my mother's jaw dropped. There was absolute silence. And then my mother said, Cipula, you're such a nice child. What have you said? Apologize to Pani Litmanovich. I said, I will not apologize. Her son is a brat. My mother said, Cipula. She reached for the conjugal, but didn't bother me a bit. I jumped up on the table. Across the kitchen there was this long table which my mother used for cut. It was a cutting table where she cut the yard goods for making up the shirts and things that she would sew. And it was a real long table, and I would just run up and down. I ran up and down that table, waving my arms, saying, "Vladek is a brat! Vladek is a brat!" And my mother said, "Cipula, if you don't come down from this table, I will call in Barrel of Escher. Just let him come, I don't care." Well, my cousin Handel was our nanny. She lived with us. And her boyfriend lived upstairs. He was right in the apartment above
What was
us.
his name?
His name was Yitzchak. He was a shoemaker. And they would hang out together. And sometimes they would communicate with each other by, my cousin would take the broom. And she would take the end of the broom and they had a code. So she'd knock with the broom on the ceiling. And then, that Yitzchak lived upstairs. Well, there I was running up and down on the table, and then there was a knock on the door, very ominous knock, very loud. And my cousin Handel went to the door, opened the door, and in walked this creature, the best way I could describe it. Couldn't see the face, but it had a hood over the face. And if I had not been so astonished, I probably would have noticed that he was wearing my grandmother's fake fur jacket, which always hung at the end of the kitchen. My mother couldn't throw it away, apparently. And so he was wearing a shuba, and in his hand he carried a long poker. And if I hadn't been so astonished, I would have recognized that was the poker my mother used to stir the coals in the stove. And in his hand he had a bag. And he walked right over to that table, and by that time I wasn't shouting. I was just standing there frozen. And he said, "Is this that naughty girl, Celia?" And I just stood there. And he said, "Yeah, that's that naughty girl, Celia." And he picked me up, put me inside the sack, and started to walk out. I could feel him walking out. Well, I could feel that he walked outside into the hall because it was very cold. It wasn't heated. And then I could feel that he walked up some stairs. Well, halfway up the landing, halfway up the stairs, there was a little landing. And I was inside that bag, and I remember it like it was now. I mean, it was very exciting. I wasn't frightened. I was just excited. I thought, what will happen now? You know, where will I go? And I said, "Hadamitashit Berlavesher," which means, well, he caught me, Berlavesher. And at that point, I could feel the bag being lowered, and Yitzchak just started to laugh out loud, real loud, ha 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 ha, you know, reached into the bag, took me out, carried me down to my mother's apartment, opened the door, and he said, "Rivka, put that child to bed." And so I went to bed, and I finally found out who Beryl Lavesha was.
He was Yitzchak.
There was no other terrorizing person than Yitzchak, my cousin Handel's boyfriend. I just wish I had remembered that over the years, you know, as I grew up, and the things which frightened me. I wish I had remembered to think back and say, you know, most of the things you're afraid of are no more frightening than that. You can really gain control of them if you use your head.
Didn't you say he was also wearing a fur, like your mother's fur or his mother's fur?
I said it. It was a shuba. It was a fake fur jacket.
All right. Other early experiences in Preston, like school, that you had a story you told about the teacher telling you to take a bath or...
Oh, yeah. Well, I was the kind of child who believed everything. The teacher's word was law. We worshipped our teacher. Her name was Panna Bichuvna, and I loved her dearly. But she would give us certain pieces of information which she thought was important. There was no running water in Piotrków, so it was very difficult to take a bath. And Jews, of course, had the mikvah, but and you know it was required in Jewish law or tradition for men and women to go to the mikvah once a week, so they were clean. But I don't remember my mother ever taking us to a place for a bath. We had a tub in the house. It was like a tin tub, and I don't know how often this happened, but we were given baths in the tub. But the teacher said, you really have to take a bath at least once a week and wash yourself thoroughly every morning. Well, the water in the house, there was no heat in the kitchen, and the water was drawn from a well outside. We had a water carrier who brought the pails of water in.
The house was not heated.
No, it was not heated. The only heat came from the big black stove in the kitchen, and on holidays and Shabbat, we had the white tile stove in the big room. We didn't call it a living room. It was more like a bedroom, but it had two large beds, and then an open space with a table and chairs, and a chifforobe, like a closet. The closets were not built in, and that dressing table with a mirror. But anyway, we lived in the kitchen. I got out of my warm bed went into the kitchen, and I told my mother I had to have a pan for water, because the teacher said I have to wash myself all over. And I had to have a washcloth, and with that icy cold water, I washed myself all over, and then went into the big room to get dressed. And then, when I was all dressed, my mother had bought me a set of a knit hat and a scarf, and I hated them. For some reason, I hated that hat and scarf. I didn't want to wear it. And every day, when it was time for me to leave, my mother would take the hat and scarf, put the hat on me, and I would scream and holler bloody murder. And I wouldn't walk out of the house. She had to substitute something else. So one day, she met Panna Bichuvna on the street, and she told Panna Bichuvna what trouble she was having with getting Tipple off to school. So the next day, Panna Bichuvna told a story to the children. She says, you know, I have a story to tell you. It's a very good story. And it's about a little girl who's sitting right here in this room, but I won't tell her name. Now, every morning, when she gets dressed, she insists on washing herself with ice-cold water so she could get sick and get pneumonia. And that is not a very good thing for her to do. She should listen to her mother and follow her mother's instructions on how to wash herself. And the other thing she does, when it's time for her to go to school, her mother puts on a perfectly lovely hat and scarf on her, and she just screams and hollers, and she just won't leave the house with that hat and scarf. She says, that's a terrible way for a child to behave. Don't you agree, children? And of course the children all said yes. And then she said, now, I hope she changes her ways. I'm going to speak to her mother. But if she doesn't change her ways, I will have to tell you who she is. So that was the end of that kind of behavior. My mother didn't have to invoke Barilavesh. It wouldn't have worked anyhow, because I knew who he was.
Yeah. That was a wise teacher. What a good.
She was lovely. She was just a lovely person. Now one day, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was Mr. Vladik Litmanovich who did that. By the way, Vladik Litmanovich's father was a school teacher, and they were really one of the elite, the educated people in town. And how they got a brat like that for a kid, I don't know. He had red hair. He was a holy terror. But anyhow, the kids in the classroom decided that they would make it tough for one of our teachers. Panna Bichuvna taught us reading, writing, and arithmetic, the main subject, but there was another teacher who was called in for some special learning. I don't remember what it was, but we didn't like her. We just didn't like her. And so the kids decided they'd make it rough for her. And one day they decided that when she comes in, when the bell rings and we all sit down, one person will start to cough, and then another person will join in, and then in a few minutes, the entire class would be coughing, and you couldn't hear her talk. Now, I don't know if I would have joined in on something like that, because I was not a mischievous kid, and the chances are that I would not have done that. I had a great respect for rules, but regardless, I wasn't in on it. All I knew that I heard the coughing, and the teacher ran out of the room in tears. She just couldn't get control of that class. Well, Panna Bichuvna came in, and of course the minute she walks in, it was quiet. She didn't say a word then. She didn't say anything. She just went on with the class. She just went on teaching. And we waited. She kept us waiting for 3 days, and we were really worried because we didn't know, what the consequences would be. She just kept us guessing and full of anxiety. And then, on the 3rd day, she told us what we had to do. She said, if you want to get back in my good graces, you want me to be your teacher, because if you don't do this, I will not be your teacher. She said, I want you to go to that lady's house. No, I want you to go to that teacher's room, and I want you to elect representatives. And then you go to her room and apologize to her. and tell her that you'll never behave that way again. But that's not the way it was. What it was, well, she didn't say a word, but finally we decided that we would send somebody. We would go to her house, and we would ask her what to do to get back in her good graces. So I was part of the delegation. I don't know why, because I was very shy, and I'd probably be terrified to speak. But anyway, we went to her house, and one of the interesting things about that place, they had a toilet with running water, a flush toilet. That was something very unusual in Piotrków, because they didn't have running water. But anyhow, it was Shabbat, and we knocked on the door, and Panna Bichuvna opened the door, and at the table sat her father, who looked like a prophet, long beard, and very dignified man, and he was sitting in front of a chumash, which was open, and his son, who was, I'd say about 10, 12 years old, the father and he were studying the book together. I think what he did was he had the boy read it. He would listen to him and read it, and it made a tremendous impression on me. Tremendous impression. But Panna Bichuvna took us into her room, her bedroom. And I still remember the bedroom. It was a long, narrow room, and it had something which I'd never seen before. It had a folding screen with some beautiful pictures on it. And she said, "Yes, why are you here?" And we said, "Well, we came to talk about our behavior. We would like, to make friends with you again. We want you to be the way you were before. We don't want you to be silent and cold, because we all love you." And she said, "Well, what you have to do is go to apologize. Go to the teacher's room and apologize and promise that you'll never behave that way again."
Wow, she really had you in the palm of her hand.
Oh yes, she was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And when I went to America, she gave me a book as a parting gift, a Polish book called Quo Vadis. Somewhere, I still have it somewhere in the house. It has fallen apart.
Wow.
Books in Poland at that time, they were paperback books, but they weren't. It's a very poor country, and people couldn't afford to buy books, so they were made very cheaply. But I do remember it had a white cover with a green design on it, and it said Quo Vadis, and Quo Vadis means "where are you going" in Latin. It was a story about the early Christians in ancient Rome. Why she would give me that book, I don't know, because it seems sort of not in character. But she was really into Polish literature, and it was by Henryk Sienkiewicz, who is one of the great Polish novelists. So she gave me that book, and of course I would never forget her anyhow, even if she hadn't.
Was it about a journey?
No, it was not about a journey. No, it was a story about the persecution of the early Christians in ancient Rome. But it did introduce me to the history of ancient Rome and the life they led there. Mm-hmm. It was a fascinating book. I remember it very well. And once in a while, when I find the pages, I like to read it in Polish, because I can understand it. I don't understand every word, but I can understand the words in context. But it was really an adult book, and I was only 11 years old. So I think she was thinking about my future, Mm-hmm. She wanted me to have something of Polish literature that was worthwhile. I think that must have been her thinking.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Well, now that you're up to that, you're up to the getting the book and preparing for your journey, can you tell us what it was like to cross the ocean?
There's
No.
one
How about
story.
the time Uncle Bokersh came back to visit?
Oh, yes.
Uncle
Lag
Bokersh.
BaOmer, the Lag BaOmer, the walking.
Oh, the Lag Gomer story. Well, of course we celebrated all Jewish holidays, and Lag Bomer is usually celebrated by having a picnic. We'd go out to the fields but this particular time, it must have been a community plan, and we all went to the woods. And I remember the woods, they were very thick, lots of trees, and the whole day was spent in the woods, and we ate our lunch there. on the ground, and it was a wonderful day, wonderful day. And then at the end of when it was getting late, around supper time, we started to leave the woods, and it seems that the Zionist organizations in town decided to have a parade back to town. And they marched in formation with their Zionist flags, which were blue and white. Of course, there was no state of Israel then, but we had our Jewish flag, which is a white field with two blue lines at each, some distance from each end, and then in the center, the blue magen david. And I remember watching them, and I remember the joy I felt at seeing those Jewish flags, being held aloft, and with the people marching in formation. And then suddenly, this was at the end of town where they did have little houses, and the Polish people lived there. They were sitting on their porches, and then suddenly stones were flying, and the stones were thrown, broke up the parade, and everybody ran for their life because, listen, stones can kill you. And they broke up the parade. So that was one instance of anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism.
The next day they arrested the Jews.
What's that?
Didn't you say the next day they arrested the Jews?
Oh yes,
for
next
creating
day. The next day they arrested the Jews for causing a riot, which was very reminiscent of the kind of things that happen in southern towns when black people were in trouble, The black people would always get the blame, and in this case, the Jews were blamed for the riot. Now this story, I can't verify it, and I gave you kids a book about Pyorkov, and nobody mentioned that story, but I haven't read the entire book. But I went to visit, my brother and I were sent to my aunt in a little village called Gidle. It was near the city of Radom, and my aunt, Yiddish, was it Yiddish? No, I can't remember the woman's name. But anyway, she was a very poor woman. They lived in one room, which they rented from a Polish farmer. And it was the village version of an apartment house. It was a stucco house, whitewashed, with a thatched roof, and it had, maybe 10 rooms. And my aunt rented one little small narrow room which had 2 beds in it, and a closet, a chifforobe. I told you closets were not built in Poland, not the places I knew. And there in that room, she raised her only son, Label, who became a sort of a dental technician. And he had gone to high school, which was, to the gymnasium, which was for a little village like that, a person growing in a little village like that. He was considered quite educated. And there was a local noble, I would say, a Polish noble, who had a young daughter. Now that noble's house was at the other end of the village, it was down the road from the village. And it was a house about the type of a 2-story colonial house, such as we know. But in Poland, that was quite elegant, considering where we were, this little tiny village with the thatched roof houses. But this was quite an elegant house. I never went inside. And I remember it was behind an iron fence, so it had a nice park. The building was inside a nice little park. And as you walked down the walk, there were trees lining the walk on either. They formed like a wall, and they were lilac trees. So it must have been wonderful when the lilacs were blue. But anyhow, this girl was very fond of my cousin Label because he was educated and he was a very handsome young man, and he spent a lot of time in that house with that girl. However, there was a girl in the next building. She was his cousin, and they had been childhood sweethearts. She felt quite left out, when he was romancing this Polish girl. I don't know what happened between them, but eventually he married this Jewish girl. And I understand that at the time of the Second World War, he was very active in the underground, and he was active in making false passports. The Germans, the word for passport is Ausweise, and he made these false passports. So he saved quite a lot of people, but they apparently caught him because he did not survive the war. Neither did his parents, and neither did his wife. So,
Now, there's a couple of more things that happened in Poland before you went to the United States.
well, you want to hear about Uncle Bechersh?
Yeah.
All right, let's do Uncle Bechersh.
Well, I might as well tell you the whole story of Uncle Bechersh. Start at the beginning. When my grandfather, Sender Eichel, died, my grandmother was left with 9 children. Now, the oldest ones, Yankel and Avram, were already grown up. And Avram was a Schneider, a tailor. And Yankel, I don't know if he had a trade, but they both went to a city, I don't remember what it was called in Polish, but the German name was Königstadt. Górny Śląsk. That was the name of the Polish name for the city, Górny Śląsk. And they went to live there. And my uncle from somehow, although he grew up in the same household, he was far more refined than his brothers. He acted like an educated man and was quite knowledgeable. And he started a business. He had a clothing business. And my uncle Yanko worked in the coal mines. He was a coal miner. His wife, Rachel, was left in Piotrków. And my uncle Yanko would return once a year to Piotrków. And after he left, he always left his wife a present. She was pregnant when he left. And I remember one night when she was giving birth to the baby, my mother sat up all night making infant clothes out of this very fine silky cotton. And when the sun rose, the baby's layette was all finished, and she went down to the house to deliver it to my aunt Rachel. Now Bechersh was there was Ephraim, and he was a baker, and Bechersh was the bad boy in the family. He had been in a fire, and he had some kind of injury, so it left him, sterile. Left him sterile. And he knew that. And I don't know whether it was that or the loss of his father.
How old was he at this time?
He was about 14 years old when his father died. And like I say, when once my mother revered her mother as, the staff of life, because she was the youngest child, and when her father died, her mother was her, she was both father and mother to her, and she always felt that her mother was a support, and she was strong, and she was wonderful and wise.
What was her mother's name?
Her mother's name was Mindel, Baba Mindel. And my mother always told wonderful stories about Baba Mindel. She thought they were wonderful, but I had different ideas. Like one of the stories she told, one of the daughters, my mother's older sister, Ciocia Gitel, the name for aunt in Polish is Ciocia. We called all our aunts Ciocia. Ciocia Gitel, they went to school. There were free schools. The Tsar had free schools, believe it or not, and the kids could go as long as they liked. Gitel was very talented academically, and it was difficult. The Jewish community founded their own schools, Jewish schools where the children learned Yiddish and Hebrew and also the required Polish. And they offered Giedel a scholarship to go to their school. And this is the story my mother told about my grandmother's wisdom. And it's simply a question of values, you know. She said, my grandmother said, listen, if you educate her, she will become a stranger to me and she'll be ashamed of me. And I don't want to lose my child. Therefore, I don't want her to be educated.
Huh.
And she withdrew Giedel from school because she couldn't afford to keep her there. You know, the kids had to earn their own living. My mother was 8 years old when she was apprenticed to a woman named Sura Cheks. Sura Cheks had an 8-month-old infant. My mother's job was to carry that infant around. And then on Fridays, her job was to clean up the house, an 8-year-old child. So she told her to scrub the kitchen floor. Well, they didn't have linoleum or anything. They were just unfinished wood floors. And my mother had to be on her hands and knees with a pail of soap and water. And Sir Checks followed her as she was scrubbing the floor. And if there was a little blemish left, she'd say, you have to do this over again. And then her mother was living with her. And when it came time for meals, she did not eat with the family. They would give her dinner first, and she would make the soup. And instead of giving her meat, she would take the bone out of the soup. And that's what that's what she gave to my mother, soup with a piece of bone. So my mother worked there 1 week, and on Shabbat, she would go home to her mother. That was the arrangement. So she went back to Bubba Mindel and she told her about these things. She cried. Bubba Mindel said, you don't have to go back there. You will not work. I will take care of you. And she did.
Wow.
But when my mother was 13 years old, she made an arrangement to apprentice her to a seamstress in Częstochowa. Częstochowa was a very interesting city. It was the city where they had the shrine of the Black Madonna. And the Black Madonna was a legend. Well, she was supposed to have appeared when the Turks invaded Europe. They went as far as Poland. And when they came to Częstochowa, the legend is that the Poles went out to fight the Turks, and the Black Madonna appeared to them, and that gave them so much courage and strength that they defeated the Turks.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, Panna Petrovna, she told us the story in our classroom, she also told us the name of the Jewish men who were in the army. That was very important for us to know.
Mm-hmm.
Our schools were separate. The Jewish children went to a separate school at the request of the Jewish community. Because I remember when the first day of school, when I was enrolled in the first grade, and there was a lot of animosity between the Polish children and us. One of the things, I went to school to that school for about a year, because I remember one of the subjects that was taught us was religion, and the Catholic children, the priest would come in, and during that time we left the room, went to another room, and Panna Petrovna's father, for some reason, he had a different name. His name was Pan Zloty, which means gold, Mr. Gold. And he came and he taught us religion, which was mostly Bible stories. And of course, I loved the stories and I visualized them. Now, I had a very good opportunity to visualize one of the stories because my cousin Handel's boyfriend, who lived right upstairs from us, they had a mural in their apartment of Solomon's judgment. And I don't remember, I'm no judge of, I was certainly not a judge of art at that time, but it was a very realistic picture of the two women. One woman on one side, looking very mean. She was probably the one who was not the real mother. And on the other side is the woman who's pleading, holding out her hands like this. And then Solomon is holding the naked baby with a scythe in one arm. So it was a very vivid picture. But I never doubted the truth of these stories. And that these stories actually happened. and that these were real people. And I'll tell you another thing about the biblical characters. To my mother, the way she talked about them, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Jacob, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Avram, the patriarchs, they were real, such real people to her that I believe they were real. It's like she knew them. She knew them as well as she knew the people that she dealt with in the marketplace, you know? They were real people. Shimshon HaGibber, Samson the hero, Gibor means hero, yeah. Samson the hero. He was a real person to me. And when I heard the story, I took such great joy and pride in the fact that, you know, he was so strong and powerful. And of course, I wept at the fact that he was betrayed by Delilah. And all the other stories, Surah, Rivka, Rochel, Leah, the matriarchs, were such real people to my mother. Sometimes she talked to them. Sometimes she would ask their advice, you know? They were real people to her, and she made them very real to me. So anyhow, to get back to my Uncle Bechersh, there he was, 14-year-old kid, and the way my mother talked about my grandmother, Bubba Mindel, you know, she was the great heroic character. But one day, this was in New York when I was a grown woman, we were going to my brother's house, which was a big journey for us, 30 miles from Brooklyn. And my mother started to talk about Bubba Mindel, and Uncle, at that time we called him Uncle Bechersh. Uncle Bechersh piped up and he said, "Don't talk to me about your mother. See, it wasn't his mother. Your mother, Bubba Mindel. She was the one who put my father in his grave, in an early grave." Well, I just sat up there. You know, my ears just opened wide because there was this great heroic woman. And he's pulling her down, you know, he's putting her down. She was not only, she wasn't a heroine, she put his father in his grave. He said, "In the bakery, every night I would be sleeping on the piekelik." The piekelik was like a shelf right next to the stove. It was the warmest place to sleep in the whole house. And they slept there in the bakery. And all night, all you could hear from Mindel was, "Where will we get a naden for 5 daughters?" A naden is the dowry. She had 5 daughters to marry off. None of them were in any way near the marriage. You know, they were little kids. But all she could think about was, 5 daughters, where will we get a naden for our 5 daughters? And she wouldn't let him sleep. So that's what Bechersh remembered about Bubba Mindel. Anyway, after his father died, and knowing how that obviously he revered his father and thought less of his mother, it must have been very difficult for him. And he became a juvenile delinquent. He hung out with the tough guys in the city. Now, Bubba Mindel tried to carry on the business. And by the way, this is a story my mother told about Bubba Mindel. I might as well tell it to you here. When her husband died, there she was a widow with 9 children. And she sat down and she talked to her children. She said, "Now listen, children, I'm going out to the marketplace. I'm going to carry on my life just as it was before." She says, "If I go out and I cry before people and tell them, 'Oy vey, I'm a widow, I have 9 children to support,' they'll all run away from me. But if I walk proudly and hold up my head high, then they'll all respect me." And that's what she did. Anyway,
What was her business?
they had the bakery. So at first she tried to carry on the bakery. And she was not very successful at it. And so she owed the flour merchant a lot of money. So one day she apparently saved up enough money to pay him on account. And she gave the money to Uncle Bechersh. She said, "Go to the merchant and come back with, I don't know how many pounds of flour." So he went to the merchant, and he gave him the money, and he said, my mother wants some more flour. He said, oh no, I'm not giving her any more flour. That's the end of it. And that put an end to the business. And he was afraid to go home. So he didn't go home. He just hung out with the tough guys. Well, these guys were, I guess they organized robberies. And so when Uncle Bechersh joined them, he figured out a real wonderful heist. He organized the whole thing. By that time, his mother was selling bread in the marketplace. And these so-called merchants, I want you to know what their goods consisted of. It wasn't very much. They were very poor people. And my mother had a stand in the marketplace. By that was at one time, that was before my father left for America. They would sew up the shirts and aprons and different things that peasants bought. And they had these two horses with a board over it. That was the store. And that's where you kept your merchandise. But at night, it was too far to cart it home. So what they would do, there was a square next to the marketplace. And the people who lived on the square would rent out parts of their apartments or rooms or basements to store the goods in. So there was this one house of this woman, her name was Rivka Shana Greenas, which means Rivka, the daughter of Shana the Green One. And that's where they stored the merchandise. So my Uncle Bechersh decided that that's where they'd make their heist. Listen, all at one time they could steal all the merchandise in the marketplace. But there was one thing he was not going to do. He was not going to steal his mother's stale bread. So everything was stolen except Mendel's merchandise. He might have as well have left his calling card with his signature. Because the next day, the police came to my grandmother's house and arrested him. Well, he might have been the bad boy, but my grandmother wasn't about to see him go to jail. So she decided that she would go see the prosecutor and make a plea. And this is the way my mother told the story. She went to his office with a Bible. And when it was time for her to go in, she got on her knees, holding the Bible up in her hand. And she pleaded with him and she said, listen, I'm a widow. And he's one of my sons who helps to support me and my children. If you put him in jail, who will support me? What will my children do? And the man was adamant. He said, I'm sorry, he was caught with the goods, you know. and he had a trial, and he was given a jail sentence. Well, the jail was right in the middle of the town. I remember the building. It was buff, trimmed with red brick. It was quite a pretty building, and it had these bars on the windows. And my grandmother, when she would go home from the marketplace on Friday, she always carried a challah with her for Shabbos. So she had the challah under her arm. My uncle knew she would be passing by, so he'd stand by the window and say, Mama, give me the challah. And she'd say, gay and dreared, which was a nice curse, because she was so angry she never forgave him for disgracing the family. And then, when he got out of jail, well, you just couldn't have the disgrace living with you right there in the town where everybody knew you. So what do you do with the disgrace in the family in those days?
Send him
Ship
off.
him off to America. So Uncle Bechersh went to America. Now, I don't know if he was married to Tante Cyril at that time or not, because they had a romance very early. I know he married her when she was 16 years old. So,
He was 14 when he went to jail.
Jail,
So
yeah.
it must have been a few years later,
you know,
several years
a
later.
couple of years later, he left for America. Maybe he went with her, maybe he sent for her, I don't know. In those days, you didn't have to become a citizen. So you could probably
That was way before your father went.
Oh, yes, many years before. So he went to America, and in America, Uncle Bechersh was not a juvenile delinquent. He wasn't a delinquent. He was a great success. because America had possibilities for Uncle Bechersh. At that time, they were organizing the,
I don't feel bad about my business anymore so far. Come on.
okay, so at
All
that
the
time,
better, right?
they were organizing the Bakers Union, the Jewish Bakers Union. And if you went to the owner and you said, we want you to recognize the union and deal with us, and the owner said, nix, forget it, they went out on strike. What did the workers do? Sabotage. They needed some bold fellow to be lowered into the bakery at night. By being lowered, for some reason the Jewish bakeries all had these little high windows, little narrow high windows. Now who volunteered to be lowered into the bakery? Bechersh. So the bakers adored him because he was bold, he was fearless, he was not afraid to speak up, and he was not afraid to do the sabotage. So they lowered him into the bakery with a pail of sand, and he would throw sand into the machinery. And when the bakers came in the morning, they didn't know there was sand in the machinery. Yike! The machinery didn't work. The bread came out, full of sand. And so, the Bakers Union was successful. They were recognized. And Uncle Bechersh was rewarded by being elected a delegate. That means he was the representative for the union. So with it came perks. He had a big black car, shiny black car with red velvet upholstery. And he drove around in that car, terrorizing all the traffic in New York City, because Uncle Bechersh didn't believe in rules. He didn't believe in living by rules in any aspect of his life, and he certainly didn't believe in traffic rules. So he would go down the street expecting every car to drop dead because he was coming. But it just didn't happen that way. So every time that I came to New York, Uncle Bechersh always had a trial coming on. Eventually, he learned that it's no use. He's not going to beat the New York traffic rules. So he hired a triber. He always found some poor schlep who couldn't make a living any other way, and he paid him to be his triber. And he was like, my uncle never traveled without,
That was his chauffeur,
that was his
limousine
chauffeur.
driver.
Yeah, that was his chauffeur. Well, Uncle Bechersh was the only person that we knew who owned a car. That is, he didn't own it, belonged to the union. But, he drove a big black car with red upholstery. And when we came to America, everybody traveled by subway, and, streetcars. Not Uncle Bechersh. He traveled in the big black car. And Uncle Bechersh also he was a gambler. He loved horse racing and cards.
And women.
And once a year, he would take Tante Cyril to Saratoga Springs. That was, spas were very popular in Europe. And they carried on the European tradition. So she would take the baths, and he would go to the races. You'd never see him. He was never around. He was always at the races. Or else he would be playing cards. And I want you to know, in these watering places, and that happened when they went to Mount Clemens, Uncle Bechersh had an eye for girls, women. Tante Cyril, she knew all about it. But she was the ever-faithful wife. When she taught my sister some of her recipes, because she was a fabulous cook, she gave her the recipe, she told her just how to do it, and she said at the end, and don't forget to put love in it. And of course, when Bechersh was sick and when he had his heart troubles and everything, he went to the gambling joint, he went to the races, but he always came home to eat because he knew that Tante Cyril's food was the good stuff, that would keep him well. Well, at some point in his life there was a great success in America. He decided he would have a Lustreise. Lustreise means a visit to the hometown, to visit the folks back home. But No, most ordinary people would write their families and say, listen, I'm coming on, so, I'm coming to visit you and you should expect me, etc. Not Uncle Becher, she didn't live by any rules. He made his own rules. So one night in Poland, we were all sleeping, but the night before had been one of these lively nights when we were all awake, and Handel, my cousin, and her boyfriend Yitzhak carried on a broom conversation all night. And this night, we were really tired and sleepy, and we're all fast asleep, and suddenly there's a knock on the window. At first, probably nobody heard it, but it got very insistent, very loud. And my mother woke up, and the rest of us woke up, because by that time, it was really loud knocking. The room we were sleeping in, that was the main room of the house, and it had a very large window. Something like this had a window seat. And my mother had yellow drapes, yellow cotton drapes, that they were drawn at night so the cold wouldn't come in. Well, she went to the window, and she opened up the drapes, and she said, "Who is it?" Of course, it was pitch dark outside. There was no light. Said, "I'm your brother, Bechersh, from America." "Bechersh? From America? What do you mean you're my brother? I don't believe you. It's a ghost." She said, "Shed gate zurück in dein Käfer. Ghost, go back to your grave." But the knocking insisted. She said, "Give me a simon as die bist Bechersh. Give me some signs that you're Bechersh." So he told her.
I just stole your 2 horses.
Something like that.
Well, I stole 2 horses and that.
Well, after, he convinced her that he was Bechersh. So she said, "Okay, I'll go open the door, come in." So there was Bechersh. Well, I will say this. We didn't see too much of Bechersh. I don't know how many weeks he spent in Piotrków. The next morning he went directly to the China. The China where his friends hung out. And for the time that he was in Piotrków, his friends had a great time.
What was the China?
The China is like a tea room. But the China was more than that. It was like an inn. They had good food and beer and lunch meats and all kinds of stuff. And he treated his friends royally because, he wanted to show them what a great success he was in America. And one of the things he arranged, and that was typical of Uncle Bechersh, would he ever do anything straight by the rules? Of course not. He found somebody, a forger, who forged a passport for my cousin Handel. By that time, Yitzchak was in Paris, and she wanted to join him, and it was very hard. I don't know what the rules were in Paris, but it wasn't that easy to go there. They did not allow unlimited immigration. And so my Uncle Bechersh arranged for her to go to Paris through a forged passport, where poor Handel left for Paris, and they discovered the forged passport, arrested her in Italy, and she spent 8 months in Italy in jail.
Oh, Handel?
Handel, yeah. And it was a really learning experience for Handel, because Italy was not Poland, she was in Rome, a big cosmopolitan city. And even in jail, the rabbi of Rome came, or some representative of the Jewish community, came to visit her, and she must have spent some free time in Rome, because she told us that girls there had bat mitzvahs. That was in the 20s.
Really?
Yeah. She told us about that.
Huh.
Probably when they let her out of jail, the community must have hosted her for a few days. But anyhow, she came back to Poland. Eventually, she did join Yitzchak in Paris. And, of course, she and her sister Gutcha and her husband Aaron, they all perished in the Holocaust.
And Yitzhak.
And Yitzchak, of
course.
That-
Mother, do you want to go on, or do you want to finish this later?
No, I think I'll stop here. My throat is dry. And
Okay, I think this would be a good, place.
We'll talk.
Well, I just like to amend two stories that I told yesterday. Remember Pani Kuzanovska? And she was the milk lady who used to invite my mother and with the three kids to spend the day with her. Pani Kuzanovska must have used that milk money for what you call mad money, but invariably, after she collected once a week, she would get drunk. And one day she came to our house, and my mother let her lie down on the bed, and all afternoon she vomited. She was drunk.
Now, who was she again?
Pani Kuzanovska, she was the milk lady. She was the woman who delivered the milk to our house.
She was no relationship to you?
No, she was a Polish woman.
Okay.
And yesterday I told the story of how we used to go to her house to spend the day there. She would invite she would invite us to spend. It was like going to the country, because it was at the edge of town. Her husband worked for the railroad, and they had this little brick house, and these two, what I remember, beautiful, healthy-looking Polish girls with their long braids, always working on their schoolwork whenever we came there.
Okay.
Now, Pani Kuzanovska had a son who was killed at the end of the First World War, and this is how he was killed. When they announced the independence of Poland, the Poles, of course, had been dreaming of this and working for it for 100 years. They tried to liberate themselves, and it was a great day of celebration. It also went to their heads, especially the people who weren't too much occupied with thinking, but more with feeling and an excess of patriotic fervor. So Pani Kuzanovska's son was then 17 years old, and he said, I'm going to join the Polish army because at the end of the First World War, Pilsudski had formed a Polish army and tried to liberate as much territory as he could, so that when the settlement was made, Poland would get the maximum amount of land. And so this boy said, I'm going to join the Polish army, and then I'll go out and I'll shoot me some Jews. So he went out, joined the army, and the very first day that he was engaged in fighting, he was killed, and they brought him home to his mother.
The war was still on?
Yeah, well, the war was sort of over, but the Poles were still fighting.
Oh.
And they brought the body home to his mother, and he was buried in her backyard, in her garden. So the grave was there. And of course,
Did she tell you that's what he had said about killing
Yeah, how
Jews?
did you know his?
well, my mother told me the story, so I can't tell you how my mother would know, except that I can tell you this. If Pani Kuzanovska told her the story, then the chances are she repeated what her son said, because they were quite open about their anti-Semitism. They were not ashamed of it. They didn't try to hide it.
Did they make anti-Semitic comments to you when you?
Oh, well, my worst experience with anti-Semitism, aside from the fact that our school principal, see, all the teachers weren't all Jewish. Most of the teachers were. We had a separate school, I told you that, the Jewish community.
For the Jewish kids?
Yeah, for Jewish kids. They asked for a separate school. Now, the principal was a Polish lady, a very aristocratic type, and she was very tall and stately looking, and she would address the whole school at our assemblies and make anti-Semitic remarks. I can't remember the exact nature of them, but I do remember, even though I was a child, I came here at the age of 11, I would remember that I could feel my skin burning when she made these remarks. So they weren't very subtle, because if I could get them as a child. Now, the other experience I had remember I told you at the end of our square, our street, Shevska, it opened up into a square. And on one side of the square there were stores and a hotel. And they were very elegant little stores. Well, one of the stores had Christmas decorations. And it must have been in the winter time. In fact, I know it was the winter time. I stood in front of that store and looked at the Christmas decorations. You know, the kind of things you hang on a Christmas tree. You know, those shiny things, balls with all kinds of beautiful colors. And I stood in front of that window and I admired those decorations. I didn't know what they were for. I didn't know that they were for the Christmas tree. We knew about Christmas trees. In fact, the name for Christmas tree was choinka, which means, what's the name for a tree that grows all year round that has needles? Evergreen. It means evergreen tree. But I didn't know that that's what they hang on the choinka. So, but they were beautiful things. I was a little kid. They were beautiful objects. And I saved my money. I used to get maybe 5 groschen every week. That was my allowance. So the minute I got that 5 groschen, I would run to the end of the street and then across the street, and there was a little store there that sold red candy whistles. And I would immediately buy myself a red candy whistle, blow the whole allowance. But when I saw these things in the window, I decided I would save my allowance and buy myself one of these things. 1 or 2, whatever I could save up. So I finally saved up enough groschen, I don't know how much it was, and I went into the store and I asked the storekeeper how much they were. And he said to me, "Why would a Jew like you want things to decorate the Christmas tree?" And I just burst into tears. How he knew I was a Jew, I don't know. But that's what he said. And of course, the word for Jew in Polish is Żyd. And it's both the name of a people and also a derogatory term. So, and he said Żyd to me. Ordinarily, if you said it to a girl or a woman, you would say Żydówka. That would be the feminine. But I remember he used the word Żyd, which made it more ugly. And I ran out of there in tears. And I was standing in front of the store sobbing. And along came my teacher. He was Polish. He was not Jewish. And he said, "Tesha, why are you crying?" And I told him. And he said, "You know, there are very cruel people in this world. They're not good people. And you shouldn't let a person like that make you unhappy. Just don't listen to people like that. They're bad people." So you see, not all Polish people were.
That teacher was not Jewish.
No, he was not Jewish.
Well, what about Connie
Puzanowska.
Puzanowska's family? Your mother had told you, that her son
Yeah.
had made this anti-Semitic remark about why he wanted to fight in the Polish army, and you said they were very open about their anti-Semitism. Did they say things like that to you openly?
Not to me personally, but in conversation, even when they were doing mostly Jews, the relations between Poles and Jews that I was aware of was mostly business transactions.
So comments, when you spent time at their house,
Oh yeah, we did.
you were friendly,
Yeah.
and yet you were aware of their anti-Semitism because
Oh,
they
yes.
made comments frequently.
I don't know how frequently, but it was not unusual for, in their dealings with Jews, for Poles to make anti-Semitic remarks in the course of the transaction.
You can understand it by going back to this country about like in the 1940s, and white people would say, they might be friendly with black people, but they might at the same time just make these derogatory comments.
Right in front of them.
Racial
Yeah, they
comments,
would. They
exactly.
would.
And the black people would accept it.
They didn't accept it. They were probably boiling with rage inside. But what could they do?
But why did you keep going back to their house? Why did you?
It was, my mother liked the idea of spending the day in the country. And it wasn't a friendship of mutual admiration. I think it was a friendship of convenience. You know, she would come to my mother's house. She knew she was always welcome. When she came there drunk, my mother would accept her. She didn't criticize her or, throw her out. And in fact, the one afternoon I remember she spent lying on our bed with her head down. My mother had a pail for her to catch the vomit. She was vomiting all afternoon.
So human relationships are complex and not that easily explained.
No, they're not that easily explained.
No.
Okay.
No.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
So, did you want to talk now about
Grandma smuggling in World War II?
World War
World
One.
War One?
Oh yes. Well, of course, there's one other story about Pyotkov I'd like to tell you. Now, I'm not absolutely sure who told it to me. I wasn't there, and I cannot verify. When I gave you that book about Pyotkov, I was hoping that when they did the chronology, they had a historical chronology. I thought that would show up, but it didn't. However, this is what I heard when I came back. I went to my brother and I went to our aunt's house in Gidle, in a little village. I think I told you about that. How I I don't know if I told you that. I played with the children of the landlord who was Polish, and talking about anti-Semitism. We played all day. Then in the evening I went to her house, and they had these little paperback books that were very common in Poland. Paperbacks were popular there before they became popular here, simply because they made books very cheaply so people could buy them, because people had very little money. And I picked up one book, and I started to read it, and it was anti-Semitic. It had caricatures of Jews, the stereotype caricatures of Jews. And I remember reading that book, and I had to leave. I felt so bad, I just went home. Went back to my aunt's house. But anti-Semitism was open, and it was practiced without shame.
Okay.
So, oh yes, so you want to hear about my mother smuggling. Oh no, this other story I wanted to tell you. There was one little street, in fact it was at the opposite end of the square, was a very similar street to Shevska. It connected those squares with another square where the old church was. The church had been destroyed in some way, was never rebuilt. But anyway, that little street was the street where all the bookstores were. And for some reason, the owners of the bookstores were all Jewish. I don't remember that there was a Pole who had a bookstore. Now, my brother and I spent a few weeks in this little town Gidle, and when we came back, I heard two stories. One of them was the Polish community had started a cooperative bookstore, and it was on the square around the corner from the book street. And I went inside once there to buy graph paper, because in school apparently I must have been learning something that required the use of graph paper. And when I went inside, I saw the sign on the wall. It said "Swojda Svega," which means, there's no exact translation. It means only people of our kind. We want only people of our kind here, not the others, meaning no Jews. So, I was a child, but those kind of things registered so strongly that I still remember it. And then somebody told me this story, that after the store was open, they had the opening apparently when I was gone, that they organized a pogrom on the bookstores, and that a bunch of hooligans went through the street and threw the books out into the street. It was like a precursor to the book burning in Hitler's times. In Sophie's Choice, remember, Sophie's father had a scheme for how to eliminate the Jews, and he had written it out, and she kept that at the top of her stockings. She slipped it into the elastic that held her stockings up. She felt that she could always show it to her Nazi persecutors, to show what a good Pole her father was, that he had a scheme for how to get rid of the Jews. Well, it was that kind of thing. So, yes, anti-Semitism was prevalent, out in the open, was practiced unashamedly. And for myself as a child, I know that I felt humiliated by it. And also helpless. Also powerless, helpless. Because you felt, how could I defend myself against them? The power is all on their side.
Now we'd like to hear about
Grandma's
smuggling, World War I.
Okay, now, my parents love to talk about their experience in the First World War. And one of the experiences that my mother talked about a lot, because it must have been something that registered with her, is that she smuggled let's see, what is naft? Kerosene. She smuggled kerosene from Piotrków to Lodz during the war. And then when she came back from Lodz, she brought bags of sugar. Now, apparently there was a shortage of sugar in Piotrków and a shortage of kerosene in Lodz. These were neighboring cities. They were like sister cities, and they were only divided artificially because of the war, because the Russians occupied Piotrków and the Germans occupied Lodz. So my mother and the other smugglers, they would get, I don't know what you call them, they were like balloons. It comes from an animal, and it's used for stuffing sausages. But
An intestine?
Yeah, but it was...
A bladder?
A bladder, yeah. They would get a bladder, fill up with kerosene, several bladders. My mother was a very slender woman in her young days. She was very slender. And she had a very small bosom. So she would have two balloons, to fill on her bosom.
Oh.
And then she padded her derriere and also her hips. So she wore a big ample skirt that covered all of that, and of course a blouse that gave her a full bosom. And they had arrangements with the soldier guards at the railroad station. They gave them a cut of their take, Every time she came back from Lodz, whatever money she had earned for the kerosene, whatever profit she had made, she'd give a cut to the guard. So they had a free operation, It was safe. There really was nothing dangerous about it. And they had the same arrangement in Lodz. They bribed the guards there. And this went on for I don't know how many months. Then one day, they posted a new guard who wasn't in on the scheme. And when he looked at my mother, he got very suspicious and he said, "You, go in there, put her in a booth, and send in a woman to examine her." And of course, she found the bags of sugar and the empty bladders, and the whole scheme was given away. So they confiscated the sugar. Oh, my mother also brought back cigarettes. She had, in the skirts, they had big pockets, and they were filled up with cigarettes. So my father always came to the railroad station to meet her. And this time she was delayed. They told her that she was arrested. And my father just waited there, wringing his hands. Oh, God, what's going to happen to my wife? They'll put her in jail. But they didn't put her in jail. They just confiscated all the loot. So while she was getting dressed, the woman walked out of the room. My mother filled up her pockets with the cigarettes, which the woman stupidly left there. And then, when my mother went out to meet my father, she had to walk all across the railroad station. And she said, walk behind me. And she would stick her hand in her pocket, drop a package of cigarettes. He would pick it up, put it in his pocket. That's why she walked to the other end of the railroad station. And my father picked up all the cigarettes, so she didn't lose out on that. But I always thought...
Why did she do that? I mean, because they were going to examine her at the end?
Yeah,
Oh.
it was, so she salvaged the cigarettes that way. But,
She was pretty gutsy.
yeah, it took a lot of guts to do it.
Why did she smuggle in the first place?
That's exactly, I always assumed, I never asked until very late, shortly before my mother died. I asked her, but I always assumed that because it was wartime and it was harder to make a living, that she was helping out. It was a desperate struggle to make ends meet. But so I asked my mother, why did you do it? She said, for adventure.
Oh, huh.
And I looked on my mother in a new way, because my mother was a very gutsy woman. And of course, you know about the time she defeated the United States Army. Would you like to hear that
Yeah.
story?
Oh, are you starting
was that?
a new thing now?
Yeah,
Why don't the tape is, you got 10 more minutes. Can you put 10 more minutes into
I
this?
think I can tell
Go
in
for
10
it.
minutes.
It's almost, you can just see it through this thing.
Well, when my two older children were very young, I would go to New York periodically, maybe every other year, to visit with my parents and my family.
By train.
By train. In those days, there were airplanes, but they were not commercially viable. In any event, very few people traveled by planes, certainly not anybody I knew. So the train ride took 14 hours. It was a long, schleppy journey, and I would prepare toys and games and different things, and of course, I brought lunches. We always ate dinner in the dining car, because by the end of the day we were so pooped.
And who were the two older children?
The two older children were Rosalind and Margaret Ann, of course, Moppy. And so
And this was in the 1940s.
in the 1940s.
During World War
yeah,
II.
During World War II. Well, one time I was going home from New York. I was going back home, and the railroad station was filled, absolutely filled with soldiers.
Grand Central Station in
Grand
New York
Central
City.
Station. You couldn't walk, so it was like Christmas time at Hudson's used to be, You couldn't walk through there. It was just so thick with soldiers. And we came to the train, and we sat and waited till it was time to board the train. Then I took the two children, one in each hand, had to carry the luggage down. There was no way to check the luggage. And of course, my mother and father always accompanied me. There was a very high staircase to walk down. It was very difficult to maneuver with the suitcases and the two little kids. And so my mother started to walk out with me. And the guard said, "Where's your ticket?" And she says, "I'm going with my daughter. I'm helping her with the children." He said, "I'm sorry. This is, we can't permit that. This is wartime."
Did he have a gun?
Oh yes, he was carrying a rifle. And she just pushed my mother back. And she was left behind. Well, I somehow got down the staircase, got into the train, carried the suitcases up, settled the children down, and I began to read them stories. This took about half an hour at least. And all of a sudden, I'm looking up at the window, and there's my mother's face. She's knocking on the window for me to, well, the door was open. She came into the car and she said, I said, Mama, how did you get through? The soldiers wouldn't let you through. She said, I was standing there and I was so angry. Imagine he didn't let me go say goodbye to my children. So I went up there. She said, I pushed both the soldiers. There were two guards with rifles, one on either side. She said, I pushed them with my elbows and I said, you're not going to keep me from seeing my children. And I just ran down the stairs and they just let me go.
That was a gutsy woman.
Yeah, she had a lot of guts.
All right, now the story. Alex, do we still have time on this tape?
Well, I'll just finish up with saying, showing how gutsy she was. When we came to the United States, it was July 28th, 1928, a date, of course, that was engraved on my mind and my heart. And my aunts had been here for many years. They came as young, well, Tante Celia came with Uncle Blair, and Katie came here when she was 14 years old. But they did not know how to travel on the subway. My mother was in this country 2 weeks, and she went to Manhattan on the subway.
Wow.
So that shows you what kind of gutsy person she was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so did he say we should stop this tape and go on to a new one?
Yeah, I'd like a drink of water.
Okay.
I'll bring you some water.
There's a story, an analogous story. The first time I went in an airplane, I was 11. Manny had driven me to New York
Yeah, I remember.
on a wild car trip, going 80 miles an hour all the way. And I had gotten pneumonia,
Yeah, I remember that.
and so they had me take a plane home. And of course, the entire family came out to see me off. And Grandma somehow was not there when I left, when I was actually going to get on the plane. And I was 11, feeling so sophisticated, wearing a dress and my little red vinyl purse. Maybe it was leather, maybe that was before vinyl existed. And I was sitting with two adults, feeling so sophisticated. And all of a sudden, there's Grandma coming down the aisle of the plane. They didn't let anybody onto the airfield
I
with
have
a
the
bag
tape.
of
Just do that.
Monolin. And I was so humiliated because it showed that I was still a child. And she handed me this bag of Monolin, and I wasn't going to let them stop me. And
Oh, no.
oh,
Well, she defeated the United States Army.
that's right. So she wasn't going to let any civilian guard stop her.
Excuse me. I'm going to stop the tape now. I'm going downstairs in the elevator to get the other tape, and then we'll begin again with the second tape.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bon voyage.
Bye, Alex. He's disappearing.
Let's play the tape tomorrow when Manny